That's what was so frightening for them, is that it probably was a moment when they had thought, look, we have lived in the Pax Romana. We have been untouchable for more than 2 centuries. We're ruled by Marcus Aurelius, the greatest Roman emperor that has ever existed. This is a golden age. To suddenly experience a disease that they could not stop and for it to rock their world, it just must have been so terrifying.
Did plague bring an end to the era of Roman peace? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Colin Elliott for a conversation about his book, Pax Romana, the plague that shook the Roman world. We are going to be diving into the depths of the Antonine Plague. Where did it come from? How did it spread? And just what level of damage did it wreak on the ancient world? The book is a great read. I would highly recommend it if you are interested in more. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and more from us, like a weekly bonus podcast, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about plague in the Roman world. Dr. Elliott, thank you so much for taking the time to come back to talk about your recent book, Pax Romana, the plague that shook the Roman world. The link is down in the description for anybody who's immediately interested, because you're like, I am very fascinated. Hopefully you're all fascinated about the idea of plague in the Roman Empire and the impacts of all of this. So Dr. Elliott, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, Jordan, great to be with you again. Thanks for having me back.
Can I start with, I guess, a basic question for someone who's coming in and they're thinking, well, I'm interested in, maybe the Roman world, and I have some personal experience with, mass sickness events in recent history. And why does this plague matter so much, or at all, I guess, in the context of our life? Because it's not been recent that this plague was knocking around. So
No.
why dedicate your time, I guess, is the question I'm asking, to write the book?
Okay, in some ways, this is a bit of a spoiler, but we'll just get it right out of the way. One of the big reasons that the Antonine Plague matters even to us is because it was, as far as I can tell, the first time a pandemic was sort of recognized as such. The word pandemic is a Greek word that would make us think that the idea of a pandemic is a very old thing. But for ancient peoples, diseases were normally highly localized. They affected a neighborhood, they affected a settlement, or maybe a city. And a region was just the idea of a disease affecting an entire region was really something pretty outlandish. But this was the very first time in the Roman Empire, in human history, as far as I can tell, that a disease affected everything. There was nowhere in the Roman Empire you could really go. I mean, there were a few places where it seems like the disease did not have a strong presence, but for all intents and purposes, most regions of the Roman Empire, certainly most cities, probably dealt with this pandemic. Now, why that matters to us is because the pandemic that we all lived through was, of course, not the first pandemic, but it was the first time that basically anyone in living memory had dealt with a pandemic of such severity, and just that kind of captured our fears and our anxieties, and it really it was like, in some ways, experiencing a pandemic for the first time, because for all of us, there was nothing like that. And so what you get is, in addition to just the disease itself, you get all of those social the social tumult and the anxiety and the angst and the fear. You get that with the COVID-19 pandemic, because it had been so long since human society had really dealt with, on a global scale, a pandemic. And in that sense, what happened with the Antonine Plague in the Roman Empire and what we experienced, there's a similarity there. Now, the diseases are different. This historical context is, of course, very different. But the idea of a disease being something that you can't escape from, that is unleashing a lot of social and economic and other forces alongside of it, that's something that we do have in common with the Antonine Plague vis-a-vis the COVID-19 pandemic.
So a lot of potential connections here for the types of concerns and responses. Can we step back, I guess, into some of the middle of that answer to frame when and where this emerged? Like what period in the Roman world and what specific regions? Because you say, it reaches very broadly. But do
Yeah.
we know anything about a point of emergence for this, or does it just kind of show up onto the scene all at once and everywhere?
Yeah, let's go ahead and set the stage. So, first of all, we're talking about the 2nd century AD. So, the 100s AD, right around 155, 160, 165. We don't know exactly when this thing emerges, and we don't entirely know where. There are some theories based on some really scattered evidence. For example, there is this kind of cryptic inscription in the highlands of Yemen that mentions a disease that is wreaking havoc in this pretty remote region. And within a few years, there's another mention of this, of what appears to be the same disease in a Roman source. And then you have a proliferation of sources discussing diseases and outbreaks of disease in a few different places in the Eastern Roman Empire, and then also moving into the western parts of China and then into the cities of China as well. So we're middle of the 2nd century, Roman Empire, but also other parts of Eurasia as well. We don't have enough detail in a lot of these descriptions. And again, the descriptions are from all over the place. They're inscriptions, they're little offhand comments in literary sources. You could even look at things like statues and artistic representations of certain deities that are associated with plague in what's called the in kind of the central part of Asia in the Kushan Empire. So who knows if those are associated with the same disease? But the point is, something began to happen biologically in human populations. Maybe it was the same thing, maybe it was several different things, but that all happens around the middle of the 2nd century AD. The vast majority of our most descriptive sources, though, are in the Roman Empire. So we do tend to think about this disease in its context in Europe, the Near East, and North Africa, but there are plague events or epidemic events across Eurasia during this same time.
So it's not just directly tied to those specific Roman contexts or concerns or settlements. It is a much wider phenomenon.
It appears to be. Now, I have to be very careful because the descriptions of the disease are, for the most part, very scant. I mean, we only have, for example, the Roman doctor Galen really giving us a good description of symptoms. So the sources in China, for example, do not describe symptoms. They just describe death rates in some cases, or just highly sort of subjective ideas like it killed many people or killed many soldiers. So does that mean that this is the same disease in every place? No, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't not mean that either. It's just we want to be careful about tying every epidemic outbreak during this chunk of time, together with the same disease event. But if we look at just the kind of cluster of sources about disease generally, there is a clear sort of a mountain peak during the years about 155, 160 to around 180, 185, 190.
Are there any events that align with kind of these windows of time that may have fostered the emergence of something to become so widespread within, I mean, you have a wide variety of contexts, so that feels kind of hard to potentially argue, but is there a confluence of people or animals or whatever that might have become the origin point for something like this?
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of thinking that we employ when we try to look at the idea of a disease spreading across multiple regions, especially in a pre-industrial context, because in the ancient world, we are talking about societies that, yes, live on the same landmass and they have some connections with each other in a loose sense, but the geographic barriers matter, mountain ranges, deserts, the water boundaries matter. These things can all be crossed, but the extent to which large amounts of people or animals are moving across these barriers is very limited for the vast majority of pre-industrial history. But yes, during this period of time, we do have some things happening which may explain how a disease could have burst out of one particular region and began to surge in other parts of Eurasia. There are really two factors. One is we have what is called the Parthian War, the Roman Parthian War, which begins in the early 160s, 162, and it runs until late 165 or 166. That war pulls Roman soldiers from it's the first major war that the Romans fight in decades. There had been a period of peace, and yes, soldiers are being sent to different parts of the Roman boundaries to kind of collect taxes and engage in low level amounts of kind of policing and other forms of basic military action, but no kind of large scale war. And this is the moment when the Romans and the Parthians just dump soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers. The Parthians go into their western border, bringing soldiers from all across Persia and the other regions that they control. And the Romans do the same, pulling soldiers from Europe and the Middle East and a variety of other places. And there's this huge confluence of people. Probably 100,000 or more people just jammed into one particular region. So that is one critical event that happens at this time, while you have these epidemic outbursts being seen in several inscriptions and sources in that area. The other thing that happens, which is a more general and broader phenomenon, it's not tied to a particular event, but commerce between Egypt, which is in the Roman Empire, the East Africa further south, and then India, as well as Han China. That's maritime transport. But then there is also abundant overland trade across the Silk Roads, across the Eurasian landmass. So that's all happening. There's sort of a real surge in that during this time as well. So you've got kind of the most movement of people and goods in a kind of commercial economic sense. And you also have this mass movement of soldiers at the exact same time. And it's all happening kind of in the same region at one of these border boundary zones, as we might think of it. And we have reports of disease just flaring up in the midst of all of this. And of course, then once the war's over, all of those soldiers disperse. Right?
Go home.
And yeah, exactly.
And take
bring
those
the disease
things with them.
That's right.
So it's I guess like a double-headed snake almost then, because those two things, when the army is there has to be trade to supply it as well. And so is there a way that these emergences, are they almost tied together in their development and then in the way they can spread this apart? Like if we had just had the war without the growth in trade, or just the trade without the war itself, a little bit of a counterfactual history question.
Yeah.
But do the two of them kind of feed off of each other to help this spread into all these regions in a way that maybe just one couldn't?
Yes, I think so. We don't have the evidence to say definitively yes, but I think we have the circumstances to suggest that is the case, and comparative evidence. So we have other instances of Roman soldiers, for example, crossing over into Persian territory. They do this numerous times. They do this under the Emperor Trajan. This was in the like 50 years prior, in the last major war that the Romans fought. That was the Roman Parthian wars that were fought around 114 to 117 AD. So the Romans go over across. Trajan actually gets sick. Roman soldiers get sick. He dies of sickness in the region. But no, as far as we can tell, no disease is brought back. under the first emperor, Augustus, who was in charge from 31 BC to 14 AD. Several thousand of his soldiers move from Egypt into the Arabian Peninsula. They go through regions that no Roman soldier had spent a lot, no Roman in general had spent a lot of time in. Maybe a few traders here and there, a few expeditions, but not thousands of soldiers. They catch disease, but they don't bring it back. Mm-hmm. So yes, I do think that the combination of so many soldiers crossing borders, but the inclusion of the commercial aspect at the same time probably helps facilitate the transportation of this disease, whatever it was.
It gives a new dynamic onto an old pattern, because it does feel like, the Romans are famous for going out and fighting people. And it's interesting that in like these examples you just gave, there's moments of disease, but that widespread nature doesn't come along with it.
Right.
Is there a Roman idea that they create? Because they have to be looking at these same type of events too, living in the midst of a plague and searching for an answer. Do they identify either the war or the trade themselves as a potential cause for the events that they're living through?
Yeah, this is a great question, because when I initially started researching this topic over 10 years ago now, I was very, very skeptical of Roman accounts, because what the Roman accounts say is, yep, the war between the Romans and the Parthians, this is where we see this happening. And they have a very they have a very religious oriented story for how the disease comes about. And obviously it's it's quite hyperbolic. So the idea here is that, they don't understand germ theory. So for them, it's not that you have a confluence of populations from sort of bringing different diseases with them, and they don't have ideas about immunity and endemic diseases. Like, they don't have any of that in their background. But these writers do seem to focus on that war as a kind of causal moment. But their explanation is religious. It's that the Roman soldiers, either ignoring the wishes of their general or perhaps with the approval of their general, commit a great sacrilege while they are sacking one of the Parthian cities. They go and there's a shrine to Apollo, who is a deity associated with disease. In fact, in the oldest writings from the Greco-Roman world, in Homer's Iliad, Apollo is kind of the first deity that we meet, and he unleashes a torrent of disease at the very opening part of that story. And so for these soldiers, they go to a shrine of Apollo, and they're just overwhelmed with bloodlust, and they start just tearing open jars and chests, and they find like a hole in the wall or a crack in the wall, and they pry that open, but there's like a plague demon or sort of a plague force that's in there, that's unleashed by the god Apollo, and that then spreads into this sacrilegious army, and in turn spreads into the Roman Empire. Now, that to them is a perfectly reasonable explanation, because disease it's not biological. Disease is religious. Right. It's caused by the gods. It's a natural outcome. In the same way that the sun rises and the sun sets, disease comes when gods are upset, and disease goes away when gods are placated. So for a disease to affect the entirety of the Roman world, there must have been some great sacrilege during the Parthian War. Now, I mentioned just at the beginning of my answer to this question that I was initially quite skeptical of the story.
Right.
But as far as I can tell from my research into when we see possible times and places when people might have spread disease amongst themselves, the Parthian War sure looks like the most likely. I could not find another obvious candidate. So even if the Romans may have explained it in a way that doesn't make sense to the modern scientific mind, this religious story may have inside of it a kernel of truth that they just don't have the medical and scientific knowledge to explain.
But they still tapped into the economic and the trade and the movement of these people and found within that the same type of thing. Their explanation just reaches for a different set of explanatory tools than something like germ theory. But that's really interesting that they are, still tapping into both something old, like you said with the Iliad, but also something very real in their ability to identify a moment for the emergence of this.
That's right.
As that plague cloud, disease, demon, whatever it is within the Roman mind or for ours, spreads out, do we have an idea of how significant it was? Like, I guess if we start with the mortality rate to compare to other plagues that people might know from history, something like the bubonic plague or COVID-19, where does this plague event rank in its ability to wreak havoc and death within the world?
Yeah, so this is kind of a funny aspect of the book, and I'm very grateful because the book's been out about a year or so. Paperback version is coming out imminently, I think, right at the beginning of August. So it's been the book has sold well and it's been reviewed well. But if there's one thing that that kind of the customer reviews, if there's one thing that has bothered some of just kind of like the general readers that have read it, is that I don't give a kind of definitive, the disease killed this many people or this percentage of the population.
We want a number.
Yeah, people want a number, and just this is one of the frustrating things about it's kind of, being an academic, sometimes we do hide behind, well, we can't know. And I get that frustrates people. But in this case, it would be irresponsible for me to put a number on it or a percentage. And the historians that have tried to do that with this plague have landed all over the place. So just to give listeners and watchers a sense as to why it's so difficult to figure out how many people died, you've got some historians that have said, okay, this disease was something like modern smallpox, and we know modern smallpox in a pre-industrial population would kill as many as maybe 30, 35%. And so that means we're talking about a death toll in the Roman Empire, depending on how big, how populous the Roman Empire was, when we're talking like millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of people. Then on the other hand, if this disease is not modern smallpox and it's something more benign, nevertheless something deadly, but not something as terrifying as smallpox, and it doesn't go and doesn't affect everywhere, and it's sort of spreading more slowly, and there's built-in kind of population immunity that eventually develops as it becomes endemic. I mean, we might be talking about a number as low. There have been historians that have said numbers as low as 1% of the Roman population, which if we then use a low population estimate of like 50 million, I mean, we're not even talking about 1 million people at that point. So it's very hard to pin down how devastating this disease was because we don't know what it is. We know some of where it went, but we have to make guesses about where it went. So part of the book is kind of, it's not just telling everybody that, the 10 facts about this disease or whatever. It's like, here is how a historian would grapple with an event that is so important, yet we know so little about it. Like, what kind of decisions does a historian have to make about different pieces of evidence to try to put together it's like a murder mystery where you only have circumstantial evidence. Like, how do you ultimately put together what happened? So for me, I will answer the question. Here's the best answer that I can give you for like how many people died. To me, we see very clear evidence of this disease in major population centers. So high density parts of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome, which did have 1 million people. We know roughly what the population was of ancient Rome at this time. Several Eastern Roman cities see this disease. It very much appears so. Smyrna, Ephesus, other Eastern cities must have experienced this disease. So just in kind of the urban population, we're probably looking at several 100,000 people dying. We also know that the disease affected soldiers in multiple parts of the Roman Empire. Yes, during the Parthian War in the east, which I mentioned earlier, but also in another war that the Romans fight immediately after that, on the northern European border along the Danube River. The disease, there's a disease outbreak there of the same plague that must have affected tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. So I think we could very responsibly say 1 million people died of this disease, maybe 2 million died of this disease in cities and among the soldiery. Where we start to get fuzzy is in parts of the Roman Empire where we don't have any evidence of disease. Does that mean there was no disease there? It doesn't. It just means we don't know.
Right.
And in parts of the population, so like rural settlements, like the vast majority of the Roman population lived outside of cities. They lived in small settlements or on small hold farms. We're talking like 80% of the population lived in a rural setting. How affected were they by the Antonine Plague? We don't know. It kind of depends on how it spread. The bubonic plague could have spread into those places because it uses animals as vectors. So that makes it pretty easy. If this disease, however, was restricted just to people and requires like regular, like high density populations in order to spread, it probably didn't make it into the countryside. Maybe not at all. So that would put a real hard cap on how many people died. So I feel very comfortable with estimates that would say something like 1 million to 2 million people died of this disease, maybe as much as 5%, maybe as much as 10% of the Roman Empire, if we're being pretty optimistic, or pessimistic because it's people dying. But I think beyond that, we just don't have the evidence to show that either way.
And it does feel that number is both, feels low if you're trying to rank it. Like if you're doing a heavy hitters of plagues throughout history, you're like, okay, well, this doesn't stack up. What's the big deal? But in the context of this being the first that spreads outside of particular regions, that number is gigantic.
Oh, it's gigantic. Yes, it does not compare to some of the waves of Black Death. It doesn't compare to some of the smallpox epidemics. Yes, it is not like one of history's, like my research, my findings would not put this disease in the top 5, for example, deadliest diseases in human history. It's up there though. I mean, and again, if we're thinking about, just the basic comparison with COVID-19. I mean, that I don't think it even hit 1% of the population. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't think it hit 1% of the global population, and it still killed a lot of people. And we really felt that disease. In addition to not just the disease, but we felt the broader, social, political fallout of that disease as well. Well, the Antonine Plague, if it killed 5%, if it killed even 1%. That alone is pretty economically, socially, and politically significant. But we have to, again, remind ourselves what we all just went through. The fact that happened for the first time, and nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew why it was. Nobody had any scientific explanation for this either. Like with COVID-19, we could kind of, I hope, assure ourselves like, okay, well, we can do these particular things. We can wash our hands. Like everybody learned to wash their hands for more than 2 seconds during COVID-19.
The songs going up next to sinks, sing as you wash your hands to make sure.
Right. We just learned some basic things that probably, we weren't doing very well. And for the Romans, they didn't have that. Like their disease mitigation, remedies, are all over the place from pouring urine on yourself to spinning around in the moonlight to some really like dark things like pummeling people with rocks. So the Romans don't have the kind of security in modern medicine that we had. So even if only 1% of the population died. Oh, and by the way, 1% of everybody. So not just the poor.
Right.
But elites as well. They could not escape this disease. Travel, mobility is a privilege in the ancient world. Almost nobody can just pick up and leave easily, not without some kind of serious devastation. If you leave your small hold farm as a poor person for a long period of time, you're probably not coming back to that farm. You probably can't get it back. So travel and movement is a very precious thing in the ancient world. And in a disease in a city or a disease in a settlement or even a regional disease, the wealthy can all skip town and they can go to a villa somewhere, one of their 5-10 villas, out in the countryside for a period of time. The Roman Emperor Commodus did this when there was a disease in Rome when he was in charge. No problem for him. So normally the elites don't get these diseases, or at least don't feel the effects of them so much. They can protect themselves. But with the Antonine Plague, that was not the case. And that's another reason probably we get so much writing about this disease, because it actually affected wealthy people. It affected elites, and that terrified them. That was new. They had not experienced that before.
Yeah, because the body count itself doesn't give the full impact, right? Just that death count is not the only way to try to measure, because you're going to have people who got sick and did not die, but live with long-term effects potentially, or the the fear of having seen it, or the impact across all social standings. That just that number, I can understand people's comments of like, oh, come on, give me a number. How many people? But that does limit in so many ways, like you talked about with our own experiences. There are other impacts, and there's other ways that people try to respond. And you tagged a couple. So can I ask you to return to that? How did the Romans attempt to respond to this thing that they saw going on everywhere? I guess both medically, like what types of treatments did they turn to? And then also socially, because you've discussed some of this, maybe the ability to leave or internal social dynamics. Could I have you turn to both of framing how they attempted to grapple with this world-changing phenomenon?
Yeah. I think I'll start just with some of the kind of immediate kind of ways in which people would try to mitigate it. They've got all sorts of religious cures. So some of that is setting up statues to the right deities. Apollo and Artemis are the favored deities in the East. We have a burst of inscriptions set up during this time in cities in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, like Ephesus, for example. Other cities have these statues set up where the god or goddess is like has an arrow, bow and arrow, and is actually like pointing that arrow, is aiming outside of the city in order to ward off plague. I don't know how many listeners or watchers have been to Pompeii, but if you go to Pompeii, you right in the gates of right into the beginning of the gates of the city. You go into the gates, and still there is the statue that was set up in Pompeii. Now, not for the Antonine Plague, but this was just a general way to ward off diseases. There's a statue of Apollo. He was holding a bow and arrow, and it's aiming outside of the city. This is like a standard way to protect from disease. So there's this huge burst in statues that are put up, inscriptions warding off the disease. People carry various charms and amulets as well. So all the way over in London, we have an amulet that was found that's got a piece of lead all rolled up. And on the lead are just a series of incantations about, warding off the disease, and like magical letters. That necklace is particularly interesting because there are letters in Greek, but also in Hebrew. So we don't know if the person, what the identity was of the person with that amulet, but it sounds like maybe a cosmopolitan person. So there's that. You mentioned like migrations. That's a big one. So, and there are other things going on at this time that are forcing people to essentially flee and rush to cities. So that's a big one. People are just trying to run away. In some sense, they're leaving places where disease is. But the other thing that they're doing is they're going to shrines and temples, and many of those are in population centers. So if this is a density dependent disease, that is, if this disease tends to thrive when people are together in large numbers, that's about the worst thing you can have, is right. People coming from the countryside who are immunologically naive. By that, I mean, they have not had a lot of experience in their body with disease. And so they don't have naturally the antibodies to the types of diseases that are floating around in the cities because they've been out in the countryside the whole time. So if a bunch of people with that makeup in their body come into these cities to go to temples to try to get relief from religious officials, priests, and deities, they are going to have the opposite experience. They're going to suddenly be exposed to a string of diseases, including maybe even the disease, the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague. They're going to be weak. They're going to contribute to epidemic surges in those cities. So, the types of mitigation measures are everything from impotent, like setting up statues, that's not going to fix a disease, to actually things that are kind of detrimental, which is people gathering in larger numbers, with people that haven't had the disease before and therefore don't have immunity. So that's probably another reason the religious makeup of the Roman Empire, that has to be another reason why this disease may have been able to sustain itself in the cities over the course of time, because you have this approach to mitigating disease.
The attempted population response keeps feeding the need of the disease with new hosts over and over again.
That's right. If I may say so briefly, like this is what happens during the smallpox epidemics in Great Britain. Same exact thing happens. You have people dying in the cities, and then finally, like after an epidemic outburst, a bunch of people die, but then the remaining population is keeping the disease alive, but at a very low and manageable level, like no more epidemics. But then you get people coming in from the countryside who have not had the disease. And when enough of them come in, suddenly the disease has a new reservoir of hosts, of victims that can then support another huge wave of virulent disease outbreaks. So probably a very similar thing happened in the Roman Empire. And that's why this disease not only was so widespread and devastating, but also seems to have lasted for so long. The disease, the Antonine Plague at minimum, appears to have been in the Roman Empire for at least 10 years. When we got tired of COVID after just a year, we were like, man, this is crazy. How could a pandemic last this long? This is nuts. The Antonine Plague was at least a decade. And this is true of the big killers in history. They tend to cycle through populations over the course of decades, in a few cases, even centuries.
In this response, because you talked some about the religious diversity here and the religious responses with shrines, cult centers that may have been a part of this. Something else you talk about in the book as well is within the religious diversity of the Roman Empire at this time, some scapegoating that also happens in attempts to respond to this, and how that both, reflects a response to it, but then you also discuss an interesting way where those persecuted groups potentially end up with different immunity factors that may lead to their own benefit in the future. Mm-hmm. Can I have you jump in a little bit on the world of the Christians inside the Antonine Plague?
Yeah. So this to me was an unexpected place where the research went. I initially was looking at this topic with really no interest in kind of the broader social or religious context. I really wanted to know about the disease and kind of the biology of the disease and it's particularly the economic impact of the disease. But what I increasingly found was that there's actually this, really interesting cultural and religious phenomenon that's happening. And it seems like the disease is contributing to it and kind of catalyzing things that are happening in the Roman Empire at this time. So I would just remind folks about what I was saying earlier about this religious framework that exists in the Roman Empire for understanding disease. Quite frankly, that framework works for understanding everything. For the Romans, religion is like the law of nature or the law of gravity. So there are two fundamental things that virtually everybody in the Roman Empire believes, even if they believe very different things, different gods, different ideas about the afterlife, to practice different rituals. But there are kind of two big principles that guide almost everything that anybody in the Roman Empire would do. And that is, number one, the gods they exist and they intervene in human affairs. So there is not a disinterested divine realm, that actually the divine realm, whatever it is and however it looks and whatever different ideas people have about it, there are sort of real world impacts of that. The second idea is that human beings can influence how this divine supernatural these divine and supernatural forces engage the world. And the way that human beings do that is through rituals and religious rites. They can engage in augury. There are all sorts of, and again, practices are varied across the Roman world, but the thing that unites them is you do need to figure out what the gods want, and then you need to do those things. And if you do those things and are very precise and particular about those things, even if you don't know much about the gods, even if you disagree about the gods, as long as you're doing the things that the gods like, you're going to be okay. If you do the things that gods don't like, well, you're in some big trouble. And so I mentioned those principles as sort of a preface to this, just to say, the Romans, that's how they deal with this disease, right? That's why they set up statues. They're engaging in things that they have done that they know work or they believe work. The Pompeians set up a statue to Apollo well before the Antonine Plague because there had been hundreds of examples maybe in their history where they did something like that and a local disease went away. And so initially that's what everybody does. They're like, right, we need to have this outburst of public religion, and whatever it looks like, fine. But different regions do different things. Now, some of these rituals begin to get dark because they don't work and the disease is sticking around. Like the old remedies aren't working. So it goes from setting up statues to Artemis and Apollo to, hey, we need to maybe there's a magician in town and we need to find that guy and we need to do something to him. Or we need to start finding people that are not participating in public religion. Those people are clearly degenerate, antisocial terrorists almost, right? They must hate their city if they're not engaging in the kinds of public rituals that we normally do. What group is increasing in population in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century? What group is withdrawn from most of the public rituals? It's Christianity. It's Christians. They don't represent a high number of people in the Roman Empire, probably still well under 100,000 people in the Roman Empire, but they are in cities, overwhelmingly in cities. The Christians are in the cities. People knew who they were. They didn't know much about them. What they knew about them was, well, they meet in secret. We don't know what their rituals are, and they don't participate in the established religious rituals. They won't do that. They're monotheists. They worship their God in a very particular way, and they don't worship any of our gods. They don't burn incense to the empire. And okay, fine, we can tolerate them as long as there aren't earthquakes or volcanoes or diseases. But man, if you get a disease that is affecting every single city in the Roman Empire, or at least many of the cities in the Roman Empire, it's also affecting elites. And you have one group in your city that aren't doing what the settled science of the age says that they should be doing, people are going to go after them. And that is what happens. We don't have any sources that directly tie Christian persecution to not participating in plague mitigation. But we do have sources that say, number one, Christians weren't participating. So we do know that. And we also see instances of Christian persecution on the rise in this period, including like one of the most brutal, the most, as far as I know, the most brutal persecution of Christians in this period in a city in Gaul. Over 50 men, women, and children are all Christians, are all murdered in that city, and then their bodies are burned. Like it's just really, this is a way, by the way, that you would deal with like dark magic or underworld, like appeasing underworld deities. So we don't have a direct tie to Christians being persecuted because of the Antonine Plague, but boy, circumstantial evidence to me sure suggests that this was the group that was targeted above all others as responsible for the plague continuing.
But, and again, one of those pieces of, as you said, it's like a murder mystery with a lot of circumstantial evidence. Many of these pieces that kind of stack together to seem to give a picture of things, and maybe all of them on their own aren't the full thing. One other detail you talked about in your book related to Christians, which I found, very fascinating, was in some of the practice of those communities, in the openness or the willingness within early church to partake in care for individuals.
Yes.
And the way that could lead to immunity building and then ideas of divine intervention. Could you say how that, I guess, fits in with this same idea of if they're outsiders
Yeah.
and they are responsible, but at the same time, if that's happening, the worldview that creates?
Right. So Romans are normally, there are aspects of Roman society that are pro-social. So you have organizations that, for example, would provide burial for their members, and you have, wealthy people have a kind of duty to care for the people in their area. So the Romans do have some of these pro-social ideas, but it seems like a lot of that broke down during the Antonine Plague in some places. Like even emperors like Marcus Aurelius, who is associated with, care and wisdom and temperance. And he is like that the first time he encounters the Antonine Plague. The second time he encounters the Antonine Plague, he just books it. He just leaves people, and he's just like, I'm getting out of here. I do not want to get this disease. So there was a limit of sort of how the kind of prevailing culture could withstand a crisis, and kind of the norms, the trust, the care, and all of that. There was a limit, and eventually that broke down. But bodies were sort of thrown different places, and all of that, like all of the veneration for the dead and all that broke down during the Antonine Plague. But among the Christians, again, we just have plentiful sources showing during this time, around this time, but also in other disease outbreaks. There was a disease outbreak. The next big disease outbreak occurred about 60, 70 years later. And we have eyewitness accounts of Christians doing the opposite of what everybody else was doing. That is, they were caring for the sick. They were going into the homes of the sick, and they were helping to bury the sick. They weren't just leaving the corpses places. They were actually like engaging in the kind of pro-social behavior that even non-Christian Romans could sort of say, wow, that's pretty exceptional. And that didn't mean the Christians didn't face death. Again, in those same sources, we do read that the Christians that cared for the dead often followed the dead in departing this life. That's something that the African bishop Cyprian says during the plague that was named after him, the Cyprianic plague of 250, 251, 252 AD. So the Christians do face costs because of their kind of radical care for disease victims. But just based on what we know of how disease works and how immunity works, again, if you have an urban population, a kind of enclave that happens to have had more experience with diseases, okay, yes, they're going to be weakened just like everybody else in the short term. But because of that exposure, and especially if that population is sticking together, they're going to, over time, develop a kind of subpopulation of more resistant, immune people. And I have to think that by the time subsequent disease outbreaks came through, that must have stuck out. So you see Christians engaging in radical care and piety after a fashion. It's not the Roman conception of piety, but it is a form of piety that eventually I think Romans could come to understand and appreciate. And they're also experiencing probably some degree of survival and resilience. And I have to think that that contributes to this explosion in the Christian population during the century that followed. The Christian church goes from about slightly under 100,000 people to over 1 million people. I mean, the growth in the 3rd century is pretty radical. And this is a very tumultuous century. This is a century full of civil war, foreign war, diseases, natural disasters, climate issues. Like there are all sorts of the 3rd century is called the crisis of the 3rd century. It is known as a period of great calamity, and yet the church, for some reason, maybe partly because of what I'm describing to you now, comes out of that century very, very well, despite also a lot of persecution in that century.
It's just such an interesting, confusing map to try to look at, because as you say, there's so many sources, but yet at the same time, their descriptions of things is not always as much as we would like.
Yeah.
What is there? What's not there? it is this. Yeah, it feels like a cloud. The plague is the cloud still trying to look back from now and trying to understand it, and where does it pop its head up, and what influence does it have?
Right.
And if I can turn to one of those influence questions, the title of your book is Pax Romana, which is a play on Pax Romana, and something you talk about in the book, because there has been conversation before about the decline of that age in the Roman Empire and its potential relationship to this plague event. As you have finished this and then you're reflecting on it and continue to think of it, I'm sure, how do you see the relationship between this plague event and its influence in the decline, the end, or the changing of that period of the Roman world?
Yeah, this was about the hardest thing to wrestle with in the book, because as I'm sure many people know, correlation is not causation. So we have this disease event, and you're right, by the way, to describe it as still as kind of a mystery cloud, right? It is just something we don't understand, which is why, by the way, despite everyone knowing about this disease for 2,000 years, my book's like the first major, book to kind of be written solely about this disease, because it's really hard to talk about a disease that we don't have a lot of evidence for. But so that also creates a tangled mess when we're looking at, okay, what are causes and what are effects here? What's causality look like here? We see lots of correlation, but what's causality? So my approach to this was, what's happening before the disease, what's happening during the disease, and what's happening after. Can we make some comparisons, like especially in places where we know that there are disease effects, and places where it looks like the disease didn't go, like how can we make comparisons about, based on regions, what else is going on in the Roman Empire? So that was a very complicated process. So if I can boil it down for everybody, what it essentially looks like is the Antonine Plague appears to me to be what I would call catalytic. So it's not causal. It's not that the Roman Empire was humming along just fine until the Parthian War, and then this disease comes in, and then there's this tank. That's not the right story. That's too simple of a story based on all of the evidence that I looked at. But what we do see is, especially if we look at prior to the disease, it looks to me like the Roman Empire was not as solid of foundations as they thought they were on economically, based on what we know about economic systems. Also, just like with what we know about agriculture, the Roman economy is an agricultural economy. It relied strongly on about 3 different regions to provide grain for all of its cities that were not provided for with kind of like a free market system, but with a system that was heavily state controlled. So you've got the Roman state heavily invested. We might, if we use modern terms, over leveraged in particular regions as producer provinces, and then providing grain for the military and key cities like Rome. So there are these kind of systematic aspects that are already more fragile than the Romans think, right? The Romans think, hey, look, we can pull grain from Egypt and we can haul it on these large ships and we can take it to Rome. Look how awesome we are. We did this huge, amazing thing with our state apparatus. If you understand modern economics, it's like, okay, yes, that's impressive, but what are you going to do if there's a problem in your one, you gotta have it, you diversify, right?
There's no backup plan.
That's right. That's right. And so sure enough, about 10 years, a little bit thereabouts, before the Antonine Plague hits, you get problems in Egypt. There are just climate problems that are totally outside of everyone's control. There are droughts in Egypt. The grain supply diminishes greatly, and there is not a kind of robust market to redirect, and price signals and all those things that happen in a complex economy that kind of keep us protected. If one sector of the economy goes dark for a period of time, there's so much dynamicity in a market economy that can help keep it resilient. The Romans don't have that. And so you get a kind of wave of malnutrition that begins to affect populations prior to the Antonine Plague. Those people are weakened immunologically because they just are not eating. They're starving. as farms begin to fail, those people have to get up and move. They don't have other farms to go to. They don't have other ways to sustain themselves. They flood into cities. So there are these kind of things that are happening that are priming the pump, that are putting kindling on a fire, that if a disease event comes in, it's going to light that thing on fire. And that's what happens. So the Antonine Plague is not acting on its own. It's coming into the Roman Empire at exactly the wrong time, when the population is weakened, the food supply is failing, there are climate issues that are happening, the army is spread out, and the army is like concentrated in particular places on the borders and is fighting active wars. This is just a really bad time for a new disease that nobody has immunity to. It's just a bad time for that disease to come. And so the Antonine Plague then, of course, it starts to depopulate, people die, but then you get kind of cascading economic effects on top of that. So people start dying in the mines. Well, if the mine isn't operating for a period of time, it gets flooded. And while the Romans have some technology that can enable them to recover some chambers and mines, they just can't totally unflood a mine. So some mines are just gone forever. Quarries, the same way. So a lot of like the stone that's used for a lot of the monumental art, like there's this huge dip in monumental architecture from the middle of the 2nd century. There's a huge dip in mine output, which of course affects coin output, because the Romans meant precious metal coins. They can't monetize their economy now. So the plague alone is not responsible for all of that, but it's sort of this glue that ties together these mini crises that maybe without the plague wouldn't have hit so hard, or wouldn't have hit all at the same time, or wouldn't have just hit in such a serious, comprehensive way. It takes all these stresses, right? It's like a stone that has got numerous fractures and cracks, and it might last for a long time, but all you need is one hammer blow at the exact right spot in that stone, and it bursts. And that's kind of what the Antonine Plague is. It's this thing that comes in at the wrong time, at a fragile moment, and it just shatters things. And then at that point, those things start acting on their own. Civil wars, further crises, a monetary crisis, those things all start doing their own thing at that point.
In this moment of, right disease, very much wrong time for Rome, is there a leadership failure that's also part of this? Because you tagged the name Marcus Aurelius earlier, and he's not alone as someone that is connected to this. How much of it should funnel back up to the top in failing to see the food supply issues and some of the ways that their economy is developed and built? Is it in some ways a top-down problem, or is this he has other concerns, or it's not his concern at all, and it would have happened regardless of who happened to be at the top at that particular moment?
Yeah, this is a great question. It ties into something that I think as all human beings we wrestle with, which is like something bad happens and we want to figure out why it happened. And we also we have a sense of justice. We want to kind of know who's responsible. How responsible were these people? How responsible were those people? And a healthy society does that, right? A healthy society tries to ask those questions and provide accountability. So if we're doing this kind of autopsy for the Roman leadership at the time, I think there's some ways in which we can hold them accountable, and then there's some other ways which we probably can't. For the kind of the natural aspects of this disease, Marcus Aurelius can't do anything about the changing climate. It's not like it's caused by Roman deforestation or Roman overuse of agricultural land or something like that. It just happens. It happens everywhere, and so and we can't hold them responsible for that. It's also hard to hold people responsible when they're ignorant. Like that is like Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations would not be published for a good 1,000 years plus. So that Marcus and other Roman leaders don't understand kind of the invisible hand. They don't fully realize like what they're doing when they use these economies of scale to focus on particular regions. Like it's hard to blame them for that. Now we can say for sure, like that to me is like a significant factor in the collapse of the Roman Empire. It just kind of economics is just it plays a huge role. But I don't really hold the Romans responsible for that because they don't really understand. They don't understand economics. But we can look at personal decisions within the kind of rules that, within the kind of morality that they themselves understood. So Marcus Aurelius, for example, is an interesting case. He's a Stoic. He's a philosopher. He really is. I think he's a kind of true philosopher. I think he really did try to live out his ideals, and these are, I think, very noble ideals of justice and temperance, and just a level of not being overly afraid of pain and not being overly in pursuit of pleasure. These are all, I think, admirable traits for anybody, to any leader. These are like things we want in a leader, and he shows those traits in some respects during the disease outbreak. So when the disease hits Rome for the first time in 166, Marcus Aurelius really acts in accordance with his principles. He can't stop the disease, but he can look at the antisocial behavior. He can say, look, we're Romans. We do not just toss our bodies out in the street. We don't steal the tombs of other people. Like, we don't just do that. And so he passes a series of laws to restrict how people can engage in burials. He provides out of his own purse for corpse removal. Like these are meaningful mitigations in an ancient context. And they also are kind of civilizing mitigations. They remind people of what it means to be human and what it means to be civilized. So he gets full marks for that. The problem is that he does also develop a pretty serious fear of disease at this point, and maybe even he had it earlier, but it comes out after this. So the next time he encounters plague, while he's trying to prepare a war a few years later along the Danube, because there are Germanic peoples that are across the Danube, is kind of a crisis. He's got to prepare a war. He clusters all the soldiers in this one northern Italian city. And of course, we get a plague outbreak because, in part, you've got soldiers coming back from Parthia that are called to that city, and several new legions are raised from rural Italy. These are people that are immunologically naive. So you combine those tens of thousands of people like that together in one city. What do you get? Outbreak of plague. Marcus at that point is like, I'm getting out of here. I'm taking my brother, who's co-emperor, out here with me, and a few people, but everybody else, you better stay here and fight it out. And it's really devastating. And Marcus just kind of leaves. He participates in a lot of the superstition, it appears. There's a guy named Alexander, who not the famous Alexander the Great, is just Alexander's a common name in the ancient world. He's like a kind of a weird, like, faith healer, cult leader type guy, and he like tells everybody to like do all like put all these inscriptions up, and this will solve this will solve your plague problem. Just write this inscription on your house, or put it on an amulet. And Marcus Aurelius is all for this guy. Like, he really thinks that this guy has some wisdom. He starts consulting him about, how can I win the Parthian War? What do I need to do? And so Marcus seems susceptible to superstition, kind of the worst aspects of superstition as well. So he's kind of a mixed bag. And then, Roman officials more broadly, the scapegoating is, I think, worth condemning. I think, even within their own religious framework, it's odd to me that the statues to Artemis and Apollo are not working, the inscriptions are not working. To go from that to let's start killing people, let's start stoning people, seems a bit of a stretch to me. And I think that's like one of the darker aspects of humanity. And again, I think this is unfortunately a thing that's always been with us as a people. Even modern even people that understand modern science and modern medicine can be very quick to find groups and sort of persecute them, ostracize them, and that sort of thing. And again, I think we saw that. So if we condemn The Romans, we can condemn them with some distance in terms of like the superstition, but there are aspects that seem to be common to humans that we need to be careful about throwing stones over, because in some of those ways, although different circumstances, we are the same as the Romans in our darker natures.
Yeah, a return to our opening question of why does this plague event matter? Some of this are very much living in similar spaces or sometimes with similar concerns. There's a quote you had I want to leave people with as we're, dumping all of this on your table and on your plate, in your ears to say, here's a big plague and here's a lot of confusing things. You had this line that I think does tie up a lot of these materials, whether it's economic or social or political, that plague didn't knock Rome off its pedestal because there was no pedestal. That, like, as I was going through this, as you walked through all of these different aspects of society that the plague interacted with, that felt like, that stone that is just ready to break when the right strike came in, and plague for the Romans very much at the wrong time came in and revealed there is no pedestal from which you fell, that things were maybe a little bit more taped together than we commonly think they were.
Yeah, I mean, and again, we love doing this because it makes us feel secure. There are lots of things that we do want to put our trust in something. We want to hope that everything's going to be okay, whether it's people, whether it's institutions, whether it's systems, whether it's ideologies, whatever it is, right? The Romans do this and we do this. We want to say everything's going to be okay because of this external thing. And for the Romans, and probably for us too, I think the thing that really scares us is when those things that we have put our trust in begin to fail us and we don't know what to do about it. And it's really hard psychologically. It's super hard to say, I was wrong. I should not have put my trust in that thing, because that says a lot about you, right? It's like, I'm the kind of person, I guess, that could get duped. I'm the kind of person that made a mistake that I thought that I was above making. I trusted something that I really shouldn't. But the alternative is very dark. And the alternative is, no, it's not that this thing is crumbling. It's not that it's failing. It's not that my ideology is wrong. It's that there's some, demon group. There's, if I just go after some external thing. But with Rome, that's what was so frightening for them, is that it probably was a moment when they thought, look, we have lived in the Pax Romana. We have been untouchable by any human institution for more than 2 centuries. We have been ruled by emperors. We're ruled by Marcus Aurelius, the greatest Roman emperor that has ever existed. Our military is the greatest. Our economy is the greatest. This is a golden age. And for them to suddenly, that generation, to suddenly experience a disease that they could not stop, they could do nothing about, they did not understand, and for it to rock their world, and then to see the fractures suddenly explode into whole cracks and crevices and fissures, it just must have been so terrifying. And a few of them probably asked the right questions. Lucian was a skeptic who did, and some of those people that I think look to the Christians probably did so out of a legitimate questioning of the existing order. But far too many of them gave in to fear. And I think that's probably why they weren't able to arrest the crises that continued to unfold over the next century or two, because they couldn't ultimately acknowledge what went wrong, or if they did, it was way too late. And that's a mistake that we don't want to make.
Dr. Elliott, thank you so much for joining us to walk back through this complicated maze that I would recommend, if you're interested, go and get a copy of the book, Pax Romana. It's worth your time. It's a fascinating read. There's a lot more depth within this as well that we didn't touch. So if you're looking for more, I would highly recommend it. Unfortunately, yes, in this murder mystery, it's not an Agatha Christie. There's no nice Poirot scene at the end to bring it all together. But I do think you'll be satisfied with your understanding of the event at the end. So Dr. Elliott, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure, Jordan. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.